So, is this an example of too much EU red tape, which Brexit would get rid of? To discuss that, I'm joined from central London by Brexit Central's Deputy Editor Hugh Bennett and The Guardian columnist Dawn Foster. Welcome to you both. So, Mr Bennett, to you first. Is this red tape gone mad, or should theatres be pulling their weight?
No, I think this is a classic example of EU micromanagement, putting overburdensome and heavy-handed regulations in place. You know, these things might look fine on paper to bureaucrats who've spent their entire careers working in the Commission and have never had a proper job. But out in the real world, these things have real consequences. And as with most EU regulations, you know, it's the small businesses, the small theatres that are going to be hit the most. You know, the theatre community is, I think it's fair to say, is not exactly pro-Brexit in general, but to have the entire industry united against this regulation shows just how poorly thought through it is. And I think it's a classic example of a failure of EU process making when they've actually, they're pursuing all of these things without actually thinking about the consequences in the real world, and it's people in the real world who are actually having to pay the consequences of these.
Dawn Foster, just that thought there that it will be small theatres that are hit the most. Do you think this is a good idea, these new rules?
I think in the long term it's a good idea, and I think that we do have to accept that we have to do a lot more for the environment. We've already, we've already devastated the globe in terms of our impact and our energy consumption. So I think that theatres do have to start moving towards more environmentally friendly lighting. I think the issue is the timescale. So 2020 is when the deadline will happen. I think the EU can meet them in the middle, and I think the government could do a lot more to help small theatres. And I think that theatres, understandably, are upset about this, but have to think about the fact that in the long term, over the next 50 years, they will need to move towards new lighting. And also, I would disagree with Hugh and say that, as was mentioned in your report, even when we do leave the European Union, when Brexit happens, we will still be subject to these regulations. So I think the government have to think about how we behave when we've left the European Union, but we're still subject to EU regulations on things like climate change.
Over to you again, Hugh Bennett. What do you make of those thoughts there, that we will still be subject to these sorts of regulations after we leave the EU?
Well, I think that's really not the case. When you look at actually the person you had the Labour MEP Seb Dance saying that after Brexit we're still going to be bound by these rules. We're only going to be bound by these rules if Seb Dance pushes through what he wants, which is for the UK to stay in the single market and the customs union while having no say. That would mean we'd have to keep applying EU rules with no say. If instead of people like Seb Dance coming and trying to sort of tie the UK in as a rule taker, they actually accepted the vote, accepted what people voted for, and got behind the UK leaving the EU properly, leaving the single market and the customs union, then we would have control over these regulations. We could change them. I think it's very rich for someone like Seb Dance to come on and claim that we're not going to have power over those rules when he's the one trying to stop us having power over those rules after Brexit.
Dawn Foster, your thoughts. Do you think this these sorts of rules being implemented, this sort of policy change, will be easier after we leave the EU, or do you think it'll be as complicated as before?
I think it will be just as complicated. I think that if, for instance, we did manage to completely get out of EU regulation, we would then have to think about how we're going to deal with all these things, how we deal with trade, how we deal with standards in food, in environmental issues, etc. It's still going to be incredibly difficult. And I think that there will actually be very little change. We'll end up sticking to a lot of the same rules, and I would disagree that that we won't end up bound by these EU rules. I think we will end up having to form some kind of fudge, because at the moment the Irish border issue is completely impossible. I can't see how Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain can entirely leave the EU and keep an open border.
And Hugh Bennett, your thoughts on the point that Dawn raised earlier about the timing of this policy change. It'll come during the implementation period that we can expect after next year. And of course, the government has said it will comply with all new laws during this time. How frustrating do you think that will be for people?
No, exactly. I think people can see it's very frustrating here. We're actually leaving. We'll technically have legally left the European Union already, and yet all these new regulations still coming down the track are still going to be affecting the UK. And while I do agree with Dawn that obviously these are issues. The issue of having a sustainable energy consumption. These are things we're going to have to tackle. But when you look at how the process works in the UK, yes, of course, it's not perfect, but people can write to their MPs, they can get in touch with Parliament, they can get in touch with their local newspapers, they can make an issue about it, like with these. When you look at how Brussels works, I think at the last count there's about 31,000 people working at the European Commission, all producing regulations the whole time. Just behind that is 30,000 corporate lobbyists. These aren't lobbyists for small theatres, for schools, theatre productions, for small businesses. These are permanent, full-time lobbyists paid for by huge businesses. These businesses can stomach the compliance costs, but they're the only people that have any influence over Brussels lawmaking. When we actually take the lawmaking powers back to the UK, it'll be much closer to the people, and small businesses, normal people will have the chance to actually influence regulations, something that in the EU only enormous corporations with massive balance sheets can actually afford to do.
And just a final thought, Dawn, on this particular policy. It's been compared to watching theatre with a house lighting or street lighting. Do you think that in this particular policy, actually, it should be scrapped, that theatres shouldn't have to comply? Because, ironically, they don't actually use that much energy because they're only using those lights for a very short period of time. Your thoughts first, Dawn.
I think that for the time being, if they can continue to use it, that would be preferable. But I think, as I said, like, theatres do have to think in the long term about how to future-proof themselves, against environmental, catastrophe that we are facing. So I think that, a lot of big theatres like the National Theatre could put a lot of effort into finding alternatives and then share that knowledge with smaller theatres. And I think the government really do have to do a lot more to support the arts.
OK, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But Hugh Bennett and Dawn Foster, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.